The dining room glowed in that soft, amber light that always made autumn feel richer, warmer. I'd polished the old chandelier myself earlier that week, the one I'd given Bessie for our 20th anniversary, so it caught every reflection from the crystal glasses. The mahogany table was set with her grandmother's china, the kind we only brought out when we wanted to mark the occasion. It should have been perfect. A Sunday dinner with my boy, his wife, and the woman I've spent 43 years loving. Judd sat to my left, cutting into his steak with the same focus he'd had as a boy tackling a model airplane. Lilia was across from me, every hair pulled neatly back, her green eyes watching everything in that calculating way of hers. She'd chosen a dress that brushed her knees just so, her posture regal, her hands drifting to her stomach every so often. I smiled, kept the conversation light, but there was a tension humming underneath it all, the kind you can feel in your bones before a thunderstorm breaks. My fork scraped against porcelain, and in the quiet between bites, she moved. Not dramatically, just a slight lean forward, the barest shift so her shoulder brushed mine. Her perfume was sharp, clean, expensive. She bent her head, as though about to thank me for the roast. "I'm pregnant with your—" Her voice was a thread, a whisper barely audible over the faint clink of silverware, but the words knifed through me all the same. She didn't even finish the sentence. She didn't have to. My heart lurched, my grip tightening around the fork until my knuckles ached. Judd was still talking, oblivious, telling a story about work. I kept my face neutral, even managed to chuckle at the right beat, though I couldn't hear half of what he was saying. Lilia leaned back, her lips curving in a smile meant for the room, not for me. Her eyes locked on mine for the briefest moment, glittering with something that wasn't joy. Bessie's voice floated in, warm and polite, commenting on the meal. I nodded as if I'd heard her properly, forcing myself to cut another bite of roast, chew, swallow, breathe. Inside, my thoughts were a tangle. Had I misheard? Was this some cruel game? What did she stand to gain? Across the table, Lilia's hand slid over Judd's, her thumb stroking his knuckles in a performance so perfect it might have fooled anyone else. But I saw the edge beneath it, the deliberate weight of her words still pressing against my ribs. I lifted my glass, joining in the toast my son proposed, and the sound of crystal meeting crystal rang in my ears, like a bell tolling for something I couldn't yet name. Whatever game she was playing, I was in it now, whether I wanted to be or not. Judd's laughter filled the room, the easy, unguarded sound of a man who still believed the world was mostly kind. I tried to anchor myself to it, to let it drown out the echo of her whisper, but it clung to me like smoke. My son was happy, radiant, even, and I sat there across from him with a face I prayed looked like his father's pride, not the mask of a man whose world had just shifted under his feet. I kept nodding, kept my eyes moving between him and Bessie, letting the rhythm of their voices guide my own small replies. But every time my gaze landed on Lilia, I felt the weight of what she'd said pressing deeper. Her expression was all soft smiles and feigned modesty, the sort of glow people expect from a woman carrying new life. If I hadn't heard her voice in my ear moments ago, I might have believed it. My mind turned over possibilities, with the precision of a craftsman checking for flaws in the grain. Had she meant to imply it? Or had I filled in the ending myself? "Pregnant with your—" could be twisted any number of ways, but the gleam in her eyes, when she leaned back, told me it was no slip of the tongue. She wanted me rattled. She wanted me to know. I could feel Bessie watching me in those moments I dared to glance her way. She has a talent for reading a man's mood, especially mine, but I'd learned long ago how to shield my thoughts when I needed to. So I smiled, sipped my wine, asked Judd about his latest project at work. My voice sounded steady enough, though my pulse was hammering. What gnawed at me wasn't just the danger of her words, but the timing. Why now? We'd managed months of uneasy civility, each of us playing our roles in the quiet drama she had set in motion. This was a move on her part, calculated, deliberate. She laughed at something Judd said, laying a hand on his arm, her eyes sliding to me for half a heartbeat before returning to him. That flicker of contact was worse than a shove. It was proof that this wasn't a careless remark, it was a test. I focused on the meal, on the steam rising from the roast, on the familiar sound of Bessie's knife tapping against the plate. But beneath it all ran the pulse of suspicion and dread, a low thrum in my chest. I didn't yet know the shape of the trap she was building, but I could feel the walls pressing in. So I kept my smile. I let my son see nothing but a father sharing in his happiness. And all the while, behind that practiced calm, I counted the seconds until the dinner ended and I could breathe without the weight of her whisper hanging in the air. The whisper didn't come to me in isolation. It landed on soil that had been quietly tilled for months, fed by moments I hadn't wanted to name at the time. Even before that night, there had been a pattern. Small things, easy to explain away if a man was determined not to see them. I suppose I had been. It started with her visits. At first, they were the sort of drop-ins you expect from a daughter-in-law eager to bond. She'd arrive mid-morning with a tin of pastries, saying she wanted to learn one of Bess's recipes or help in the garden. But over time, she began coming when Judd was at work. Sometimes she'd drift out to where I was pruning the roses, asking about soil acidity or pest control, questions that felt more like placeholders for the real reason she was there. I'd answer politely, keep my eyes on the plants, but I'd notice the way she lingered, studying me the way one studies a lock they mean to open. Then, there were the conversations I overheard. Once, Bessie found her in the kitchen, and the two of them were speaking in that careful tone women use when there's an unspoken challenge between them. Bessie laughed at something Lilia said, but it was the brittle kind, the sort you use when you don't want to show you've been stung. I asked later what they'd been talking about. Bessie shrugged, said it was nothing, but her eyes flicked away from mine. I told myself it was just my imagination. That Lilia's habit of standing too close, of holding my gaze a fraction longer than courtesy demanded, was only her way of being friendly. That Bessie's sudden silences when Lilia was mentioned were just a wife's instinctive distaste for a woman she couldn't quite warm to. And then, there was Marcus, the gardener. I catch her talking to him sometimes, low-voiced, a little too focused. It didn't seem romantic, not exactly, but there was a conspiratorial quality to it. Once, I walked up, and they both stepped apart like children caught in mischief. She smiled, said they'd been discussing tulip bulbs. I let it go. Individually, none of it was enough to accuse, not even enough to confront. But looking back, I see how it built, each oddity stacking on the last, creating a shape I refused to outline in my mind. I told myself I was protecting the family from needless drama. In truth, I was avoiding a truth I wasn't ready to face. So when she leaned in that night and whispered those words, it didn't come like lightning from a clear sky. It was the inevitable crack of a storm I'd been hearing in the distance for a long, long time. And somewhere deep down, I think I'd known it was coming all along. Judd's gambling hadn't started as a problem. At least, that's what I told myself in the beginning. A little online poker with friends from work, the occasional sports bet during football season, harmless enough. He was careful at first, treating it like a hobby. But hobbies have a way of turning into habits, and habits into hungers. I began to notice the signs before anyone else. Calls he'd take outside where no one could hear. The tightness in his voice when he said everything was fine. A bank transfer here, a short-term loan there. I covered a few of them myself, thinking it was just a rough patch. Fathers do that. We step in, we shore up the weak spots, we tell ourselves it's what any man would do for his son. Then one night he came to me with a look of a man cornered. $10,000 owed to someone he wouldn't name. He promised it was the last time, that he'd learned his lesson. I believed him, or maybe I just wanted to. I paid it off. But like any debt fed by addiction, it didn't stay gone for long. Lilia found out in her own way. I don't know if Judd told her outright or if she pieced it together from the calls, the missing money, the quiet desperation in his eyes. However she learned, she understood the value of that knowledge immediately. It wasn't just a secret, it was a leash. The first time she hinted at it with me was subtle. She stopped by when Judd was at work, standing in the kitchen with that calm, deliberate manner of hers. She said something about how hard it must be to protect family when they make questionable choices. Her eyes didn't leave mine when she added that trust was such a fragile thing. The message was clear. She knew. I tried to keep my distance after that, but the damage was done. She positioned herself perfectly, too close to expose without risking Judd's reputation, too dangerous to ignore. Then the debts grew. The people he owed weren't the kind you could stall forever. I opened a separate account, funneled what I could from my own savings, made payments quietly. And still, it wasn't enough. Lilia offered her help, then. She framed it as concern for Judd, said she wanted to ease my burden, but there was an unspoken price. I was to let her visits go unquestioned, Allow her closeness to me to be seen, even to seem guilty if it came to that. It would be easier, she said, if Bessie thought I was distracted for reasons of my own. It was the kind of deal a man makes when his back is to the wall, not out of fear for himself, but for the boy he raised. And that was the trap. I wasn't just protecting Judd from his creditors. I was protecting him from the truth of what his wife was capable of. It was never written down, never spoken in the kind of plain words you could pin to a wall, but the understanding between us was as real as any contract I'd ever signed. Lilia had a way of speaking in circles, dressing threats up in politeness until you almost forgot what they were. Almost. The first time she laid it out, we were standing in the garden, a safe enough place for a conversation that could ruin a man. She'd come by under the pretense of asking about the roses. The air smelled faintly of soil and cut stems, and I remember thinking how strange it was to be talking about destruction in a place meant for growth. She said she knew about Judd's troubles. She made it sound like an unfortunate weakness, a simple mistake anyone could make. Then she said something that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Secrets are only as dangerous as the people who know them. I told her to leave it alone, that it was between me and my son. But she just smiled, slow and measured. That's when she suggested a different story, one that explained her frequent visits, her private talks with me, the occasional look that lingered too long. If people thought something was happening between us, well, it might distract them from the real issue. It would buy her time, and by extension, buy Judd's safety. It was madness. I told her so. But she had an answer for everything. How else was she supposed to keep certain people from asking questions about where her husband's money was going? How else was she supposed to make sure I stayed cooperative in helping her manage the problem? And then she said the one thing she knew would close my mouth. If Judd knew I was the one holding off his creditors, how do you think he'd feel about me? She didn't say it, but I heard the rest in her silence. How would he feel about himself? I agreed. Not because I believed her plan was noble, or because I thought I could control where it led, but because I could see no way around it without dragging Judd through a kind of shame he might not recover from. From that day, every time I avoided Bess's eyes, every time I cut a conversation short or let Lilia stand a little too close, it was part of the performance. I told myself it was temporary, that as soon as the debts were gone, the whole charade would end. But debts, like lies, have a way of growing roots. And the deeper they went, the more I realized I wasn't part of her plan. I was part of her stage set, a prop she could move where she pleased to keep the story exactly as she wanted it told. At first, I thought I could manage it, this quiet performance Lilia had pressed me into. All it required, I told myself, was a little distance. A few unanswered questions. Averted eyes at the right moments. It would be uncomfortable, yes, but temporary. Just long enough to get Judd's debts settled and push this whole mess into the dark where it belonged. But distance in a marriage isn't a harmless thing. It doesn't just sit there, waiting for you to pick it up again when you're ready. It grows. It seeps into the corners of your home, into the quiet hours between waking and sleeping, until one day you realize you're sharing a life with someone you've stopped letting see you entirely. Dinners were the worst. Bessie would ask me something, how my day had gone, what I'd been working on, and I'd give her the kind of half-answer a man gives when he's guarding a door. She'd search my face for more, but I'd lower my eyes, cut another piece of meat, change the subject. I thought I was protecting her from worry, but each time I did it, a little more of her warmth toward me cooled. It was in the small things. The way she stopped reaching across the table to touch my hand. The way she no longer lingered beside me in the garden, but busied herself with her own tasks. I told myself it was for the best, that if she thought I was distracted by Lilia in some way, it would keep her from looking at the truth I was trying to hide. Lilia, of course, knew exactly what was happening. She'd lean in at those dinners, ask me some harmless question in a tone meant to carry weight. And I'd play my part, giving her a polite but clipped reply, never quite meeting Bessie's eyes after. It was a dance we both understood, though for her it was a game, and for me, it was penance. The nights were worse. I'd lie beside my wife, her breathing steady, and feel the gulf between us like a cold draft. I wanted to tell her everything, about Judd, about the debts, about the trap we'd both been caught in, but the thought of watching her face when she learned her son's failings was enough to keep my mouth shut. And so I let the lie breathe, feeding it with silence and carefully timed glances, pretending the cracks in our marriage were the natural settling of years rather than the slow, deliberate work of another hand. What I didn't realize then was that lies like this don't just keep the truth out. They keep everything else out too: trust, comfort, the easy companionship we built over decades. And once they've been shut out long enough, it's a hard thing to open the door again. At first, I thought I could manage it. This quiet performance Lilia had pressed me into. All it required, I told myself, was a little distance. A few unanswered questions. Averted eyes at the right moments. It would be uncomfortable, yes, but temporary. Just long enough to get Judd's debts settled and push this whole mess into the dark where it belonged. But distance in a marriage isn't a harmless thing. It doesn't just sit there, waiting for you to pick it up again when you're ready. It grows. It seeps into the corners of your home, into the quiet hours between waking and sleeping, until one day you realize you're sharing a life with someone you've stopped letting see you entirely. Dinners were the worst. Bessie would ask me something, how my day had gone, what I'd been working on, and I'd give her the kind of half-answer a man gives when he's guarding a door. She'd search my face for more, but I'd lower my eyes, cut another piece of meat, change the subject. I thought I was protecting her from worry, but each time I did it, a little more of her warmth toward me cooled. It was in the small things. The way she stopped reaching across the table to touch my hand. The way she no longer lingered beside me in the garden, but busied herself with her own tasks. I told myself it was for the best, that if she thought I was distracted by Lilia in some way, it would keep her from looking at the truth I was trying to hide. Lilia, of course, knew exactly what was happening. She'd lean in at those dinners, ask me some harmless question in a tone meant to carry weight. And I'd play my part, giving her a polite but clipped reply, never quite meeting Bessie's eyes after. It was a dance we both understood, though for her it was a game, and for me, it was penance. The nights were worse. I'd lie beside my wife, her breathing steady, and feel the gulf between us like a cold draft. I wanted to tell her everything, about Judd, about the debts, about the trap we'd both been caught in, but the thought of watching her face when she learned her son's failings was enough to keep my mouth shut. And so I let the lie breathe, feeding it with silence and carefully timed glances, pretending the cracks in our marriage were the natural settling of years rather than the slow, deliberate work of another hand. What I didn't realize then was that lies like this don't just keep the truth out. They keep everything else out too: trust, comfort, the easy companionship we built over decades. And once they've been shut out long enough, it's a hard thing to open the door again. Marcus had been working our garden for a little over a year, a quiet, capable man who preferred the company of Sol and Shears to conversation. He had a way with the roses, better than mine, if I'm honest, coaxing blooms from stubborn stems with a patience I admired. I liked him, trusted him. He kept to himself, did his work well, and never asked questions he didn't need answered. The first time I noticed him with Lilia, it didn't seem like anything worth remembering. She'd wandered out while he was trimming the hedges, a glass of lemonade in her hand, sunlight catching in her hair. They talked briefly, about the weather, I assumed, and she laughed at something he said before heading back inside. I thought nothing of it. She was friendly by nature, and Marcus was hardly the type to invite trouble. But then it happened again. And again. Always when Judd wasn't around. Sometimes she'd bring coffee, sometimes nothing at all, just herself and a question about planting bulbs or pruning techniques. I'd see them from the kitchen window, her leaning in slightly, her hand resting on her hip, Marcus nodding as if weighing her words. He never looked comfortable, but he didn't walk away either. One afternoon, I came around the corner of the house and found them standing closer than usual, her hand lightly on his arm. She pulled it back when she saw me, smiling as though I caught them in the middle of a harmless chat. "Marcus was telling me about soil pH," she said, as if that explained everything. I nodded, made some remark about his expertise, and let it pass. It's easy, in hindsight, to see how those moments stacked up. But at the time, they were too small, too ordinary to set off alarms. Lilia was my son's wife. Marcus was our gardener. And I had bigger worries, debts to settle, lives to maintain, a marriage quietly straining under the weight of secrets. Still, there was something in Marcus's eyes on those occasions, a flicker of unease that I ignored because it didn't fit the picture I was trying to keep in place. I told myself it was simply the discomfort of a man unaccustomed to small talk. I didn't know then that those quiet exchanges in the garden were threads in a much larger weave. That while I was busy playing my part in Lilia's carefully staged drama, another story was taking shape in the very place I thought I understood best. If I had paid closer attention, looked past the roses, past the practiced smiles, I might have seen it for what it was. But at the time, Marcus was just a shadow in the background, and I had already convinced myself that shadows couldn't do much harm. The first time I withdrew money from the separate account, I felt like a thief in my own life. I'd opened it at a bank 2 towns over, a place where no one knew my name or my family. The clerk had smiled politely, asked if it would be a personal or joint account, and I'd said personal, with a steadiness I didn't feel. The moment the papers were signed, it became more than just numbers on a ledger. It became a vault for a secret I had no right to keep. Judd's debts had a way of multiplying like weeds. You'd pull one up, think you'd cleared the bed, and by morning another would be sprouting somewhere else. The people he owed weren't patient, and they weren't the kind you could negotiate with over coffee. Each payment bought us time for him to get back on his feet, time for me to figure out how to keep Bessie from seeing the truth. I told myself I was protecting her, sparing her the pain of knowing her son had fallen into the same trap her father once had. But every transaction felt like a stone in my chest. I'd drive to that bank on a Wednesday morning, make the withdrawal, and tell Bessie I'd been at the hardware store or meeting an old friend for lunch. She never pressed, though I sometimes caught her looking at me like she wanted to ask something and thought better of it. Lilia knew about the account. She never said how, but she'd make little comments that told me she was aware. "It must be exhausting, keeping track of all those expenses," she'd say, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. I hated that she knew, hated that she was tangled in something meant to shield Judd, but the more I tried to keep her out, the deeper she seemed to sink her hooks. The money moved in and out in round figures, 2,000 here, 5,000 there, each withdrawal another cut into the life Bessie and I had built. I'd spent decades saving for our future, and now I was bleeding it out to keep the present from collapsing. I kept meticulous records, though I prayed she'd never find them. If she did, I wasn't sure which would hurt her more, the amounts or the fact that I'd kept them from her. At night, lying in the dark beside her, I'd feel the weight of it pressing down, the knowledge that our marriage was being funded and undermined by the same stream of cash. Every dollar I took from that account was a silent betrayal, not just of her trust, but of the life we promised each other to live openly. And still, when the next call came and Judd's voice carried that edge of panic, I'd go back to the bank without hesitation. Some debts you pay with money. Others, you pay with pieces of yourself. Lilia had a way of arriving without warning, as if the boundaries of other people's time didn't apply to her. Some mornings I'd be in the garden, pruning the last of the summer roses, and hear the crunch of tires on gravel. By the time I reached the front, she'd be halfway up the walk, her smile already in place. She never knocked, just a light tap on the doorframe before letting herself in, calling out a bright "Cedric?" as though she were expected. She always carried something, a basket of muffins, a small jar of imported honey, once a book on heirloom gardening. Little offerings, as if she were a neighbor stopping by for a friendly chat. But there was always something in her eyes that didn't match the warmth in her voice, a flicker of recognition between us that only we seemed to understand. She would find ways to remind me of our unspoken arrangement without ever naming it. "It must be nice," she said once, lingering by the kitchen window, "to have someone to talk to about things you can't share with anyone else." She didn't look at me when she said it, but her reflection in the glass was smiling. Another time, she walked into the garden and stood too close, lowering her voice just enough to make the air between us feel charged. "It's a relief, knowing you'll keep my confidences. Some men might not be so trustworthy." I'd answer in short, measured phrases, keeping my tone flat, my body angled away so Bessie wouldn't walk in and mistake the scene for something else. Still, I knew that was exactly the picture Lilia wanted to paint, that quiet implication of something improper, left hanging in the air for anyone who cared to interpret it. The worst visits were when Bessie was home. Lilia would greet her warmly, then draw me into some private exchange under the guise of asking about the lawn or the best way to protect rose bushes from frost. I'd see Bessie glance at us from across the room, her expression polite but distant, and it would take everything in me not to close the gap and tell her the truth. But the truth wasn't simple. The truth carried Judd's name in its teeth, and I couldn't let it bite him. So I played my part, kept my answers guarded, endured the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air after she left. When she walked away, she always looked back once, a small smile curving her lips, as if to remind me she was still holding the strings. And every time, I'd stand there in my own home, feeling less like a husband and more like a man trapped in someone else's story, waiting for a chapter one didn't write to end. It was in the little changes that I first noticed it, subtle enough that another man might have missed them. But after more than 4 decades with Bessie, I could read her without trying. She had stopped asking certain questions, the kind she once used to draw my day out of me piece by piece. Instead, she let silences stand, filling them with a nod or a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved differently around me too. Not colder, exactly. Bessie has never been one to give her affection grudgingly, but there was a new caution in her, as if she were stepping carefully over ground she wasn't sure would hold. She no longer lingered in the doorway of my study to chat about nothing at all. When we worked in the garden together, she chose the far bed, pruning in quiet concentration while I kept to the roses. At dinner, I'd feel her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. Not suspicion in its purest form, at least not yet, but something close to it. She was turning things over in her mind, testing pieces against each other. I could almost see her reaching for a picture she didn't want to see clearly. That was what frightened me most, because I knew what Lilia wanted her to see. The glances, the private moments, the visits when Judd wasn't around. To Bessie, those would be damning enough without context. And if she let that picture harden into truth before I could explain, then every word I might offer later would sound like a man trying to cover his tracks. More than once, I thought about telling her everything, sitting her down, laying out the debts, the arrangement, the ugly leverage Lilia had. But every time I imagined the look in her eyes when she learned what Judd had done, I stopped. I knew that look already. I'd seen it once before when she spoke of her father's gambling, the shame, the disappointment, the wound that never quite healed. So I said nothing. I played my part in Lilia's theater and prayed that the final act would come before Bessie lost faith in me completely. But as the days passed, I began to feel the ground shifting under us. One night, as I came in from locking up the shed, I caught sight of her at the dining table, staring at my place setting as if it might answer something for her. She didn't hear me at first. When she did, she smiled, but it was the polite kind you give a stranger in passing. I went to bed that night with the cold certainty that the gap between us wasn't just my doing anymore. Bessie was pulling away on her own now, and if I didn't find a way to bridge it soon, there might not be anything left to save when the truth finally came out. It was late enough that the garden had taken on that muted blue-gray light, the kind that makes every shadow seem longer than it should be. I'd gone out to check the shed door. It had a habit of swinging open in the wind, and found Lilia already there, standing just inside the glow of the security light. Marcus was with her, rake still in his hands, his face tight with something that wasn't his usual quiet composure. Their voices carried before I was close enough to make out the words. Lilia's was low but sharp, the edge in it unmistakable. Marcus's was firmer than I had ever heard it, the kind of tone a man uses when he's decided he's had enough. When they saw me, neither stepped back. Lilia turned slightly, offering a quick smile that didn't bother to reach her eyes. "Cedric," she said, like I'd been expected, "we were just discussing some changes for the garden." Marcus shook his head. "That's not what we were discussing." He looked at me directly, and in that moment I saw the weight he was carrying. "I can't keep doing this." The words landed between us like a stone in a still pond. My first instinct was to deflect, to steer the conversation somewhere harmless, but the tension was already too thick. I could feel Lilia bristle beside me, her gaze cutting toward him like a warning. "We've discussed this," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Marcus didn't flinch. "Judd's a good man," he said to me, not her. "He doesn't deserve this." My stomach tightened. The air felt close, heavy. Here it was, everything I'd been balancing on the edge of, teetering in the open, where it could no longer be ignored. Lilia's jaw was set, her posture all control and defiance, but there was something else flickering there too, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even fear. I wanted to tell Marcus to stop, to walk away before he said something that couldn't be unsaid. But part of me needed to hear what he was willing to risk by speaking. And part of me knew that my silence, in that moment, was its own kind of betrayal. Of Judd, of Bessie, of the fragile arrangement I'd been keeping afloat. "Marcus," I started, but my voice caught, and in that pause, the space between us shifted. Lilia's hand went to her hip, her smile curving just enough to make clear she thought she still had the upper hand. I stood there, feeling the walls of my own choices closing in. Every path I could take seemed to lead to loss, of trust, of protection, of the thin thread holding my family together. And for the first time, I wondered if I was already too late to save any of it. It was just after 9 when the phone rang, the sound cutting sharp through the quiet of the house. Bessie was upstairs, getting ready for bed, the soft hum of the bathroom fan masking the noise. I hesitated before answering, a knot already forming in my stomach. Calls at that hour rarely bring anything good. The voice on the other end was low, deliberate, and far too calm for the words it carried. He didn't bother with names, his or mine. Just a reminder that the arrangement on Judd's death was overdue, that the patience of certain people had limits, and that accidents had a way of finding those who didn't keep their commitments. He gave a number, higher than the last, and a date only a week away. Then the line went dead. I stayed there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the hum of silence. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. I replaced the phone carefully, as if moving too quickly might make the threat real sooner. Footsteps on the stairs brought me back. Bessie appeared in the doorway, her hair brushed back, wearing that simple robe she's had for years. She smiled, but her eyes lingered on me a moment too long. "Who was it?" she asked. I forced my shoulders to relax. "No one important. Just a mix-up about an order I've placed for the garden." The lie slid out more smoothly than it should have. She studied me for a beat, then nodded, though I could tell she didn't quite believe it. Later, when she was asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the conversation replaying in my head. I thought about waking her, about telling her everything right there in the dark. But Lilia's voice echoed in my mind from a few weeks earlier. If Bessie finds out the truth about Judd, she'll never look at him the same way again. Do you really want that on your conscience? It was a cruel thing, the way she'd said it, calm, almost sympathetic, but it had lodged itself deep. Because I knew it was true. I'd seen what her father's gambling had done to her, how it had carved something out of her that never grew back. So I lay there silent, while the weight of the debt, and the lie, pressed down harder than ever. I told myself I could fix it before the deadline, that I'd find a way to keep everyone safe, that Bessie didn't need to carry this particular burden. But as the night stretched on, the ceiling above me seemed to lower, inch by inch, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of space to breathe. It had rained earlier in the day, leaving the grass damp, and the air heavy with that earthy scent that clings to your clothes. I was by the shed with Marcus, trying to finish a conversation we'd started the week before, one I thought we could keep between us. He was restless, his hands moving from pocket to pocket, eyes darting toward the house. Then the back door opened, and Bessie stepped out. She didn't call to us right away, just walked down the path toward the garden beds, her pace steady, her eyes on the two of us. I knew that look. She'd caught enough in the past few weeks to know something was being kept from her. Marcus saw her too, and something in him seemed to give way. "Mrs. Holloway," he started, his voice tight. "There are things you need to know." I stepped toward him, lowering my voice. "Marcus, don't." But he shook his head, the resolve in his eyes stronger than I'd seen before. "Judd's not the only one she's hurting," he said, glancing toward the house where Lilia's car sat in the drive. "She's using all of us. And this thing between you and her, it's not what it looks like." Bessie froze. Her gaze swung to me, sharp and searching. "What is it then?" I opened my mouth, but Marcus kept going, the words spilling out faster now, like they'd been waiting too long. "She's been blackmailing him, making it seem like there's an affair, so no one sees what she's really doing. It's about money debts." "Marcus," I cut in, but it was too late. Bessie's attention was locked on me now, her expression a mix of anger and hurt. "Is that true?" she asked. "The thing about being married as long as we have is that there's no room for half measures. She would know if I tried to soften it, and she would know if I lied." So I nodded, the weight of it pressing down harder with the admission. "Some of it," I said. "Not all. But enough." Her breath left her in a slow, controlled exhale, the kind that tells you the person in front of you is holding themselves together by choice. "And you didn't think to tell me? I was trying to protect you," I said, though even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. "And Judd. Especially Judd." She looked at Marcus, then back at me, her jaw tight. "From the truth?" I didn't answer. There wasn't a right one. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant hum of a car passing on the street. In that moment, I realized that whatever game Lilia had been playing, the real damage was already done, not in whispers or threats, but in the look on my wife's face as she realized just how far I'd gone to keep her in the dark. We stood in the kitchen afterward, the confrontation with Marcus still hanging in the air like the residue of a storm. Bessie had followed me in, her steps measured, her face unreadable. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for more than I had given her outside. I poured a glass of water just to give my hand something to do, but it didn't steady me. "There's more," I said finally, my voice low. "And you deserve to hear it from me." She didn't speak, just nodded once, so I went on. "The baby?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of the words before I let them go. "It's not Judd's. And it's not mine." Her brow furrowed, but she didn't look surprised, only more intent, as if she'd suspected but needed confirmation. "Then whose?" I shook my head. "I can't say for certain. But it isn't ours, not in any way that matters to this family." The truth sat between us, heavier than I'd expected. For weeks I'd been carrying the lie Lilia wanted everyone to believe, playing the part she cast for me to protect Judd. Admitting even part of the truth felt like stepping out into sudden light after too long in a dark room. Bess's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice stayed calm. "And you've known this how long?" "A while," I said. "Long enough to see where it was headed. She's been using the story of an affair to cover herself, to buy time until the baby's here. Then she can twist it however she wants, make me the villain, make herself the victim. It's insurance." Her hands were folded loosely in front of her, but her knuckles were pale. "So you've been letting me believe you were unfaithful, letting me watch my own son think the same thing, all to protect him from her." I nodded. "Judd doesn't need to carry this, not now, not on top of the debts. If it came out, it would wreck him. I thought if I played along, we could keep her calm long enough to figure out a way through." She studied me for a long moment, her gaze steady, her breathing even. If she was angry, she wasn't showing it in the ways I expected. Instead, she looked resolved, as though she had already stepped ahead of me in whatever came next. "You're certain about the baby?" she asked. "As certain as a man can be without proof," I said. "And she'll make sure we never get that proof." I didn't know then that proof was already closer than I thought, that Bessie, in her quiet way, was about to find it. And when she did, the power Lilia had been holding over all of us would start to slip, whether I was ready for that fight or not. I found her in the study that evening, the lamplight warm against her face, a folded sheet of paper on the desk between us. She didn't speak right away, just watched me with that steady gaze of hers, the one that always seemed to strip away anything I might hide. When she finally slid the paper toward me, my eyes caught the header first, GeneTech Laboratories, before they dropped to the clinical lines of text beneath. It took only a moment to understand. Paternity results. The baby wasn't Judd's. The baby wasn't mine. 99.7% probability it belonged to Marcus. The words hit me like a hard wind, but not with shock, more with a strange relief of confirmation. "Where did you?" I started, but she cut me off gently. "She dropped it. In the upstairs bathroom. I doubt she meant to." I looked at her then, expecting anger, maybe even accusation, but what I saw was something steadier. A quiet determination. "You've known?" she asked. "I suspected. For a long time." My voice felt rough. "But knowing and proving are two different things. She's been holding the thread of that story over me, our supposed affair, using it to shield herself and keep Judd from seeing the truth." Bessie leaned back in the chair, the paper still resting on the desk between us. "And all this time, you've been letting her think she was winning." I gave a humorless laugh. "It felt like losing most days." Her mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. "Well," she said, "now we have the truth, and we can choose when and how to use it." It was the calm in her voice that surprised me most. I'd been bracing for a storm, but she wasn't interested in shouting. She was thinking, planning, already a step ahead. And for the first time in months, I felt a sliver of hope cut through the weight on my chest. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, and in the silence I realized she wasn't just reacting. She was building something in her mind, a way to dismantle Lilia's hold piece by piece. When she finally spoke, it was with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly where to place the first cut. "We invite them to dinner. All of us. And this time, we set the table ourselves." I nodded slowly, the relief in me mixing with a new kind of apprehension. Lilia had been playing a long game, but if Bessie had decided it was time to move, I knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't make a move unless she was ready to win. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in deep after a long day, when even the walls seem to exhale. Bessie was in bed, the lamp still on beside her, a book lying open, but unread in her lap. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if she'd even want me there, then stepped inside and sat on the edge of the mattress. "I need to tell you why I didn't come to you sooner," I began. My voice felt heavier than I expected. "Not just about her, but about Judd." She closed the book gently, marking her place with one finger. Her eyes stayed on mine, steady and unblinking, and I could see she was ready to hear it, whether or not she wanted to. "When the death started," I said, "I thought I could manage them. Quietly. I told myself it would be better that way, that you didn't need to carry that weight. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of you looking at Judd the way you looked at your father." The shift in her expression was subtle, but I saw it, the memory landing. Her father's gambling had been a shadow over her childhood, one that never truly left. She'd told me once about the night he lost their house, the way her mother's face had gone pale, how she'd realized in that instant that nothing she thought was safe really was. "I couldn't put that on you again," I said. "I couldn't be the one to bring that look back into your eyes, especially if it was about our son." Her hands were folded in her lap, still as stone. "And so you let me believe," she trailed off, not needing to finish. "I let you believe something worse," I admitted, "because I thought I could handle being the one you mistrusted. I thought I could take that if it meant keeping Judd's shame from you. But I underestimated what that distance would do to us." For a long time, she didn't speak. Then she reached over and set her hand on mine. It wasn't a gesture of full forgiveness. That would take time, but it was an opening. "You should have trusted me with the truth," she said softly. "I know," I said. And I did. The weight of it had been pressing on me for months, and saying it out loud made me feel at once smaller and somehow lighter. She gave my hand a single squeeze before letting go. "We'll deal with Judd. And we'll deal with her. But from now on, we deal with things together." I nodded, the quiet between us no longer sharp, but something gentler. It wasn't the same as before, not yet, but for the first time in months, I felt like the door between us had been unlocked. And that, more than anything, made me believe we might just make it through. Bessie waited until the following afternoon to lay it out. We were in the kitchen, sunlight pooling on the counter between us, the smell of coffee still fresh in the air. She leaned back against the sink, arms folded, not defensive, but deliberate, like she'd been thinking her way through this since the moment she found the DNA results. "We invite them here," she said simply. "Judd and Lilia. A Sunday dinner. No theatrics, no shouting. Just the four of us, and the truth sitting in plain sight." I studied her for a moment. She wasn't smiling, but there was a steadiness in her that reminded me of the way she used to tackle problems when Judd was a boy, quietly, thoroughly, with the certainty that once she decided on a course, she wouldn't waver. "How?" I asked. "If we push her, she'll deny it. She'll twist it into something else." Bess's gaze didn't move from mine. "We don't push. We let the proof do the talking. She's built her little story on suggestion and performance, and that's what she'll be expecting, more performance. So we give her the opposite. Calm. Facts. And we do it with Judd sitting right there, so she can't twist it later." I felt a tightness in my chest ease just a little. For months I'd been playing defense, reacting to whatever move Lilia made next. Now, for the first time, it felt like we might be the ones setting the pace. "And you want to be the one to—" "Yes," she said, before I could finish. You've carried this long enough. This part isn't yours to shoulder. I'll handle it. I let out a slow breath, realizing just how much I'd been bracing for another fight, another corner I'd have to talk my way out of. The thought of sitting at that table and not having to lead the charge, of simply standing beside her while she dismantled Lilia's game, was more of a relief than I could admit. You're sure about this? I asked. Her eyes softened, though her voice stayed firm. I'm sure. I know how she thinks. She'll walk in believing she's still holding all the cards. That's when we take them away. I nodded, feeling the edges of my own resolve sharpening. Then I'm with you. Whatever you need, whatever you decide, I'll back you. For a moment, we just stood there in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between us. Then Bessie reached for my hand, giving it a single, deliberate squeeze. It wasn't just reassurance, it was a signal. The game was changing. And for once, we weren't walking onto her stage. She was about to walk onto ours. I took my seat at the head of the table, the position I'd occupied for more than 40 years of Sunday dinners, but that afternoon it felt different, like a man sitting down to watch a storm roll in, knowing exactly when it would break. Bessie moved around the table with quiet efficiency, serving dishes steaming, the scent of roast and fresh bread filling the room. Judd was smiling, oblivious to the undercurrent. Lilia wore that practiced glow, one hand resting lightly on her stomach, eyes scanning the table as if taking stock of her kingdom. I kept my focus on her, watching the small shifts in her expression as the meal began. At first, she was relaxed, leaning into Judd's conversation, laughing softly at his stories. But when Bessie started talking about family resemblances, eye color, hair, the way traits surprise you in the next generation, Lilia's forked paws midair. Judd laughed at something about my stubborn chin, but Lilia's gaze flicked to Bessie, sharp and assessing, before she resumed eating. I saw the faint tightening at the corner of her mouth when Bessie mentioned modern science, how much it could reveal before a baby was even born. By the time Bessie said the word paternity, the air in the room had changed. Judd didn't notice. He was asking questions about DNA tests like it was an idle curiosity. But Lilia had gone very still, her shoulders set, her breathing just a fraction faster. I didn't speak. My job now was to sit back and watch Bessie steer the conversation with the precision of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. She rose from her chair, crossed to the sideboard, and returned with the envelope. Her hands were steady as she set it in front of Lilia. For a moment, no one moved. Lilia's face drained of color, but she didn't reach for the paper. Judd, puzzled, pulled it toward himself and began to read. I watched the change in his expression, the confusion, the dawning comprehension, and finally the devastation, as the truth settled in. Lilia tried to speak, but Bessie's voice cut through, calm and unwavering. The baby isn't Judd's, she said, her eyes locked on our daughter-in-law's. And it never was. Lilia's performance faltered then. The poise, the control, it all cracked for a moment before she pulled the mask back on. But I'd seen it, and so had Bessie. From my seat, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not triumph, exactly, but the knowledge that the truth, once spoken aloud in the right light, couldn't be stuffed back into the shadows. Whatever came next, the stage was no longer hers. And for the first time in months, I felt like the walls around us had stopped closing in. Judd sat frozen, the paper limp in his hands, his eyes moving over the words again, like they might rearrange themselves into something he could live with. I'd seen my son angry before, and I'd seen him disappointed, but I'd never seen him look hollow. It was the kind of emptiness that comes when you realize the ground you've been standing on wasn't ground at all, just a thin crust over a drop you never saw coming. Lilia's voice broke the silence first. Judd, I can explain. He looked up, and the sharpness in his eyes stopped her cold. Explain how you lied to me. How you lied to both of them. His voice wasn't raised, but the edge in it was worse than shouting. She tried to regroup, slipping into that soft, trembling tone she used when she wanted to be seen as fragile. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. Your father. Don't. Judd cut in, his gaze flicking to me. Don't put this on him. The last card in her hand was the one she'd been holding since the beginning, the story of the affair. I could see her weighing it, deciding if she could still make it stick. But the test result sat on the table like a stone in the middle of the conversation, too heavy to move around. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, and that was when I knew she'd run out of moves. I didn't say much. It wasn't my moment to speak. My eyes stayed on Judd, on the way his shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of him, leaving something raw behind. I wanted to reach across the table, to tell him that his mistakes didn't define him, that we could still put things right. But I also knew he needed space to let the truth settle, to decide for himself what came next. Bessie kept her tone even, every word measured. "You built your life here on lies, Lilia. That ends tonight." For a moment, I thought Lilia might still try to salvage something, plead for another chance, or at least for Judd to see her as more than the sum of her deceptions. But she just sat back, her hand still resting protectively on her stomach, eyes darting between us as though waiting for someone to give her a lifeline. None of us did. When she finally spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. "So that's it?" Judd folded the paper and set it on the table, his voice quiet but firm. "That's it." Relief and heartbreak knotted together in my chest. We'd lost something we couldn't get back, but we'd also stripped away the thing that had been poisoning us from the inside. And as much as it hurt to watch my son face the truth, I knew it was the only way forward, for all of us. The house felt lighter after she left, as if some invisible weight had finally been lifted from the beams. There was no scene at the door, no shouting, no slammed suitcases, just the quiet scrape of her car rolling away down the drive, and the long, slow exhale that followed. Bessie stood beside me, watching until the taillights vanished, and then we turned back inside without a word. Judd stayed that night, not because he needed to, but because he didn't want to be alone. We sat in the living room, the three of us, the air thick with things we weren't quite ready to say. When he finally spoke, it was to tell us he'd found a Gamblers Anonymous meeting in town. He said it like a man making a promise to himself, and I believed him. His voice had a steadiness to it that I hadn't heard in a long time. Marcus didn't come back. I can't say I blamed him. Whatever passed between him and Lilia, he'd been caught in her net same as the rest of us, and his leaving was as much escape as it was resignation. Now and then, I catch myself glancing toward the garden, half expecting to see him bent over the rose beds, but the space stays empty. It will for a while, I think. Some things need time to grow back. Bessie and I have settled into something quieter. There are still shadows in the corners, moments when her eyes catch mine, and I know she's remembering the months I kept her in the dark. But there's also a warmth now, a willingness to reach for my hand across the table again. We've both learned how quickly silence can hollow out the strongest walls, and how much work it takes to fill that space again. Some nights, lying beside her, I think about the road we've just walked, the lies we let stand, the truths we finally spoke, and the cost of both. I used to believe protecting the people you love meant shielding them from pain at any cost. Now I know that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is hand them the truth, even if it hurts, and trust they'll still stand beside him when it's over. The garden has started to bloom again. The roses are late this year, but they're coming. Bessie says they'll be better than before, stronger for having weathered the winter. I like to believe the same about us. In the end, it wasn't the fight that saved us, it was the quiet. The calm of a woman laying proof on a table without raising her voice. The stillness after a door closed for the last time. And the knowledge, shared between us, that love survives